Okay, so I sent you all an introduction for Walter Russell Mead, but just his byline is enough, uh, either to enthuse you or trigger you. What's more likely for this age group, you figure out. And he's yours for some time to ask questions. If I may, I'll start with the first question. You, in that lecture of yours to Hillsdale College, you talked about the four schools of foreign policy in America. That's Hamiltonian, Jacksonian, Jeffersonian, and Wilsonian. Right? Where exactly is American foreign policy now? What does it resemble most of all?
Good question. I would say the Biden administration is a pretty solid Wilsonian administration. That is, they see the goal of American foreign policy is to try to build a global order that's founded on human rights and democratic values and international law. And that's one of the reasons the Ukraine crisis has so energized the Biden administration, because this looks like a good war against a bad enemy. And here's democratic Ukraine, which is abided by international law. Here's Putin, who, in addition to all of his sins against Ukraine, runs a very dictatorial regime at home, and this matters a lot for obviously Democrats in the US, was considered to have been aligned in some way with Donald Trump. And so this is really the good war for the Biden administration. And that may also explain some of their impatience with other countries that they think have not been as enthusiastic. Because after all, when you are fighting to build a just world order for democracy and law, it's not a question of national interest anymore, because everyone has a duty to stand up and do the right thing. So oddly, Wilsonian administrations who often think of themselves as being in favor of peace and good relations with other countries end up having a lot of crises in their foreign policy, because it's very difficult for them to work on the assumption. They would say that if you work on your national interests, that's exactly the kind of selfish policies that are responsible for war and everything else that's wrong. So if people in India have been a little bit surprised at how intense the reaction was when India's position on Ukraine wasn't identical to that, say, of the US, I think this is the sort of theoretical explanation why.
Go ahead. The floor is yours. Please raise your hand, introduce yourself, and ask your question. Sure. So Pia writes about foreign affairs. She also hosts a video called World 360.
So mine's a bit of a provocative question, but a few experts like Noam Chomsky have said that, well, they've pointed out that maybe the Biden administration has not been talking about peace negotiations as much as they maybe should, and rather that they seem to be preoccupied with piling sanction on after sanction. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think certainly factually it's true that the Biden administration has not been talking about peace negotiations and has been piling on sanctions. I'm not sure exactly why Professor Chomsky would think this was a surprising thing to say, because it's sort of obvious. When you think about, I am not I'm not probably as much of a democracy crusader as some people would like me to be. But in this particular case, it's very difficult to think about what you would talk about in terms of negotiations. Are you saying that Ukraine must negotiate with Russia? After all, they are the ones who've been invaded. So if Ukraine asks you for help and you say, no, negotiate with Putin, are you then siding with the aggressor against the attack? So I think if Zelensky asks for American help in getting negotiations with Putin, we probably should do it. I doubt he will, because when and if he needs to negotiate with Russia, he knows very well how to call, make the phone call himself. So why it's the business of the United States to try to negotiate between Ukraine and Russia is a little hard for me to say. But maybe I don't know the full argument that Chomsky wants to make there.
So Chomsky and Kissinger on the same side?
That actually happens more than you would think. I would say Chomsky, Gore Vidal, and Kissinger end up agreeing on more things than many people might understand.
Give us an example.
Well, I would say that all of them generally deplore the Wilsonian instinct in American politics to construe the contest with a particular adversary as one of good and evil. All of them would tend to say that the American position is morally more complex than the Wilsonians would acknowledge, and also so is the position of the other side. So this is a sense, all three of them are to some degree realist thinkers and do take the idea of countries acting on their interests as that's the way they think foreign affairs works, and to some degree, they don't think there's much possibility of it doing anything else. And for people from this position, the charge of hypocrisy against any country which wants to say that its foreign policy is based on some sort of principle or eternal value is exactly the argument that they make. And it's less an argument about a particular policy option than a general argument about the nature of international affairs.
So tell us about the argument you've been having with Kissinger lately.
I should say that I've known Kissinger for maybe 30 years, which to him is not very long. He was celebrating his 99th birthday last week. I wrote a column at Davos because it was interesting to me that two people in their 90s, Henry Kissinger and George Soros, both made speeches at Davos that caused quite a global stir. Kissinger's speech calling for some kind of compromise peace with Putin, and George Soros' speech saying this was a war to save civilization. Again, that's a fairly Wilsonian position, the Soros position. And I said in the piece that both arguments have been misused in the past, so that the Neville Chamberlain and people like that in the 30s made Kissingerian-sounding arguments about how, well, Germany is a power and it has interests and we must understand Germany's interests. And on the other hand, the neoconservatives, in arguing in favor of the war in Iraq, made very Sorosian arguments about we must stand up for principle and democracy. And the point I was trying to make in that piece is that you really have to look at the facts on the ground. It's a mistake to have some sort of grand theory of international affairs and then you just mechanistically apply that theory to whatever situation is there. You actually have to try to understand what's happening in all of its granular complexity right here. Well, unfortunately, Kissinger got under a lot of criticism because people thought many people accused him of arguing essentially for appeasement of Putin, and that's what he's been called, an appeaser. He sent me a very angry note saying, "Why are you calling me an appeaser? We've been friends for many years and you want to compare me to Neville Chamberlain." So I had to write him a letter, a note back saying, "Well, dear Henry, that's not what I meant, and here's why I didn't think I'd written it that way." So we'll see. Hopefully the next communication I receive from him will be more positive.
See, learn to be nice to old people.
Right. Our skin is very thin. But, seriously, Henry Kissinger is, obviously many of his policy choices are extremely controversial, and certainly Indians have some sense of Kissinger that way. But foreign affairs, and this is a mistake I think people make often who have spent too much time in the classroom studying theories of international relations. Foreign affairs is not like a school exam where if you do the proper homework and you solve and you approach each problem with the proper discipline, you will arrive at the correct answer. That's not how foreign policy is. Foreign policy is more like it's a sport, like a sport, where even the greatest player in the world will make terrible errors, lose matches, commit fouls. And so in American baseball, if you get on base 1 out of 3 times that you come to bat, you actually qualify for the Hall of Fame as one of the great players, which means you're wrong 2 out of 3 times. Foreign affairs is like that. And often you find in the press and in the public, people stand back and judge like, the student has failed the exam, but if they had just done this, it would have all been perfect. It really isn't that way. And I think one of the keys to becoming a good analyst of foreign affairs is to put that sort of mechanistic approach out of your head completely and start looking at this for what it is.
Because in foreign affairs, as in sport, there is the other side. There is
That's
the other
right.
player.
As they say in war, the enemy gets a vote. What did Clausewitz say about war? He said, in war, everything is simple, but even the simplest thing is extremely difficult. And it is foreign affairs, yes, and it's not just one side that gets a vote in foreign affairs. Say with the situation with Ukraine and Russia, it's not just Ukraine and Russia, or even Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. What will China do? What will India do? Will Germany and France take the same position? Will they take a different position? Where will the British come in? All of these things happen, and they're all making their own calculations based on their own interests and their own information. Another problem is that in foreign affairs, you almost always have to make critical decisions when you lack information that you actually need to make the right decision. You don't necessarily know what your adversary or your partner, whatever, what is in their mind. There are random events that will come out of nowhere. Maybe there will be a flood that destroys the Russian army on one side of the river. The crops may fail. All kinds of things that you don't know. And so in that sense, doing foreign policy is a little bit like being a student trying to decide what college shall I attend, or what subject shall I, or even, a person, who shall I marry? You make these decisions without all of the knowledge you'd need to make a perfect decision, and then you have to live with the consequences. Foreign affairs is hard, it's difficult. That's probably the single thing that has struck me the most in my study over the last, 50 years.
I'm Snehesh Philip. I look after defense and security issues. I write on defense issues. Where does India stand as far as the Biden administration is concerned? We're talking on a day when, the religion report is out, and you are the Secretary of the State who was critical of India. Of course, none of us are happy with some of the things that are happening here. But then it was the US which kept silent all these years when it came to Saudi. So where does India really figure in the scheme of things, especially in context of China, in context of Russia, Ukraine, and also for the fact that, when I speak to people here in the Indian administration, I think they were more comfortable with the Trump administration. They're not really sure about the Biden administration. There's a trust deficit that seems to be there. So how do you look at it, sir?
Well, I would say that whatever sort of storms come and go in U.S.-Indian relations, if we stand back from each day and look at the last 20 years, we can see very clear trends emerging. And that is primarily that the rise of China is driving the United States and India closer together. And that's not due to anything we're doing, and it's not due to anything you're doing. It's just due to our mutual reflection on a fairly obvious and large-scale set of events. There's another important factor, which is that the United States relationship, American relationship with Pakistan, has also been cooling quite steadily. And with the end of the war in Afghanistan, whatever other problems there may be, the U.S. has by and large lost almost any reason to maintain much of a relationship with Pakistan. And Pakistan, on its part, has largely embraced China as its primary and really maybe even its only serious partner in international affairs. So with China uniting us and Pakistan ceasing to divide us, it's clear that the U.S.-India relations are in a different place. But it's also clear that when two countries come closer together, often their relationship can become more turbulent. Because when you are far off, there are all kinds of small annoyances. You know, there are things that would bother you immensely about your husband or your wife that wouldn't bother you at all if it was your neighbor 3 doors away who had these habits. So as two societies come closer, perhaps the American habit of giving moral lectures annoys Indians more, and the Indian habit of not listening to America's well-meant counsel annoys Americans more. And if you think about it, in some ways, when people in the U.S. now talk about the Indo-Pacific as the center of gravity, increasingly, of American foreign policy, and I myself think this is correct. And so we're moving from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific as the focus. But if you study the relations between the Europeans and the Americans as they developed during the Cold War, you'll see there's a tremendous institutional network. Americans don't naturally like Germans very much, especially in 1950. And Americans and the French always have their problems, right? But if you look at if you're a young scholar in the U.S. and you're interested in American-German relations or whatever, there are 1 million foundations and organizations in Germany and in the U.S. that will help you go spend a year in Berlin or Frankfurt or whatever, or send, if you're a young German, to America. The conferences, the networks that exist, because people in both countries have said, this is not a love match, it's an arranged marriage. And so we both have to work at making it work. I think the Indo-US relationship is going to need to develop that kind of framework. Many Indians, of course, study in the United States, and I think more will be. So there's some connectivity that way. But very few Americans study in India or know India. And so, what you need is people who have, in addition to official relations going well, and that's important, you need lots of people in your society in different professions who have not only an understanding of the other society, but personal contacts. And that way, what you often can do is say on issues like the religious freedom or something like that, instead of having the State Department issue a report which will not, I can fairly safely predict, make a lot of change in India. But if there were a group of Indians who are well aware of various issues that are in India, a group of Americans who are well aware that lectures are often counterproductive and that America also has its problems, these people could start developing frameworks and understandings that would prevent extraneous issues and controversies from arising and so enable a deeper, stronger relationship. And so I would say the test of the Indo-American relationship in the future, in the near future, is not going to be whether we manage to solve each and every difference of opinion that arises, but whether we make steady progress in developing the infrastructure, the human infrastructure of the relationship, so that as time goes on, we understand each other better and are therefore able to manage the inevitable issues more effectively.
In a sense, you described as, it's not an arranged marriage, it's a love marriage. It's not a love marriage, it's like an arranged marriage, the India-US thing. So there would be issues that will have to be sorted out.
Yes.
There's a presumption being made that love marriages don't have any issues.
Those are even worse. Right. For one thing, each side is actually, in that case, marrying not a real person, but an imaginary person. And then there's the horrible shock of discovering that, oh my gosh, you're not what I thought you were, you're you. And here we are. I am bachelor, so I have a different view.
So he can hold forth on.
Yes. Listen, I can have so many opinions about marriage. You have no idea. Yes.
Sir, it was just a follow-up. I'm Sonia. I cover education here. Do you think the Quad is the answer to this growing relationship between India and the US?
I think the Quad is a very positive development. And I think, it's interesting. The Quad is very different, say, from NATO. Europeans tend to like everything to be wrapped up in treaties and rules, bureaucratic institutions that work according to procedure. So the Europeans from the beginning sought to institutionalize the US-Europe relationship in all kinds of formal understandings. The Quad is very interesting because there isn't really a founding treaty of the Quad. It's not, the Quad members are not bound to agree on every single issue. They don't take a vote and the majority prevails or whatever it is. Each country retains its full autonomy. Nevertheless, their cooperation is deepening. Actually, in this way, it's a little bit more like the relationship that exists between the various English-speaking countries. So when you think about the relations between the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, is in terms of an international partnership that matters in the world and that gets a lot done and promotes integration, is one of the most successful international partnerships, if not possibly the most international success. But there's no founding treaty. There's no annual meeting, right? There's no, at times in New Zealand will take one view, Australia another, and Canada another. That neither blows up what people call the Five Eyes group. It doesn't cause a crisis in it. And the habits of cooperation continue to grow. I think that model of relationship is actually maybe the more common form of international relationship in the 21st century, of people who cooperate because their interests often draw them together, rather than because there are some sort of legal instrument that requires them to do it. I think those partnerships are often more flexible and stronger. So I think the Quad is actually an excellent example of a new kind of order. Again, if we look at Asian countries, even those who have defense relationships with the US, the Japanese and the South Koreans have never said to the US, we want there to be a treaty organization, a NATO for the Pacific. They each prefer bilateral relations with the US and then sort of less formal understandings with each other. I think that's we're likely to see more of that in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's also more suited to the way India likes to do business, to bind itself in some kind of permanent formal treaty alliance has never been the style of Indian diplomacy. So I think the Quad is an example of a way that these countries can cooperate more deeply while each retaining, their sovereignty and their freedom. It's not enough by itself. The Quad is not enough. My sense of how the China problem can ultimately be solved is that if the Indo-Pacific succeeds in economic development and modernization, so that instead of a few countries having achieved full status, economic status as developed countries, Indonesia, India, Thailand, Vietnam, all of these countries are more like South Korea or whatever in terms of their economic level, then it will be clear even in Beijing that no country can have a hegemonic position in this region because the region is too large, too diverse, and too dynamic. And at the point where people in Beijing understand that Asian hegemony is out of reach, not because there's some kind of American conspiracy, not because there are military ships here, but because the nature of the region doesn't permit this sort of hegemony. Then I think we see in China, maybe reluctantly and slowly, but an understanding that they need to pursue a different path, a different road. And when that happens, then I think we see the real Indo-Pacific taking shape. Cooperative, diverse, equal, neither dominated by the US nor by China, nor for that matter by India or Japan. So in that sense, the true American policy, as I see it toward this region, is to let the region be the region, let the Indo-Pacific be the Indo-Pacific. And our interest is in facilitating the development, the growth of all of these societies, and not so much containing China as balancing China by the promotion of the dynamism of the region as a whole. And that, again, the goal there is not to win a war with China, but to avoid war with China. And so the military dimension of the cooperation is during the interval when China continues to at least toy with the fantasy of becoming the hegemonic ruler of the region. It's clear that there's a military offset that makes that impossible, while looking to the reality that long-term, the real security of the region lies in the development of the region.
So with the South China Sea issue already, being a well-established matter in international politics, the string of pearls coming up, do you think American intervention in the Indo-Pacific area has come a little late and in a very soft fashion, like you just said? It's more about development than military might.
Well, I often find myself thinking of what Winston Churchill said about the Americans. He said, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the alternatives. And so classically, Americans have actually been slow to focus on, whether we think about World War I, World War II, or even the Cold War. The Americans actually didn't sort of, from the beginning, see where this was going and start taking steps and prepare. They do nothing. They chase various illusions. They pretend that this, then they adopt strategies like their idiotic strategy of non-recognition with Japan in the 30s. We won't recognize their conquests in China, but we're not going to do anything about their conquest of China. And then ultimately, then the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, and we take a different view. So it's the classic American response is that at first you are asleep and you only slowly wake. Then sometimes you wake quite suddenly and start behaving rather wildly. But and again, because the United States is thousands of miles away and protected by the oceans and by friendly neighbors, we've been able so far to get away with that. And so we have time. With China, what you can see in terms of China is if you look at the polling in the United States, public opinion has become more and more focused on the threat that people see that believe that China poses to the United States. And you look at questions like, if China were to invade Taiwan, should the United States help defend it? You now have over 50% of Americans saying, yes, we should do that. And the polling numbers continue to go up. So, I think what you're seeing is the U.S. getting more engaged. Again, that's been true. We're not the only country in the region which has been slow to recognize what's happening. Each country has had its own wake-up calls. For the Japanese, it's been some of the Chinese overflights, also the failure by China to really do anything about North Korea's nuclear program. For India, obviously, the border clashes have had a tremendous impact on people. So each society has its own. We recognize danger on a different schedule and in response to different events. And it always takes longer for a coalition to come together than for a single actor to make a determination. So yes, China has, in that sense, an advantage of speed. Does China, can China turn this into, a lightning strike that utterly transforms the situation? The key there is probably Taiwan, in that if China were to succeed in forcibly bringing Taiwan under Beijing's authority, this would, as probably most of you know, the most important semiconductor facilities are in Taiwan, and that would be a significant shock to everyone. But beyond that, if you look at a map, you'll see that Japan's trading routes, the oil that comes to Japan from the Middle East, its exports to Europe and other parts of the world, would be largely controlled by China. And at that point, there would be a lot of pressure on Japan to come to an agreement with China. And if you think of Japan and China, the world's second and third largest economies, united, and you think of Japan's technological capacity added to what China already has, that is a fundamental transformation of the situation in the Indo-Pacific. And you think about communications between India and the United States would have to come through the Suez Canal rather than through the Pacific in such a case. Australia might be isolated. So, yes, there is the possibility that, and certainly it's being examined in Beijing, that a sudden strike, if you could somehow take Taiwan, you could present the world with a fait accompli. And that is probably the thing that people in the United States lose the most sleep about, is that possibility.
Rama? Rama is our opinion leader.
Hi. There was a lot of disruption that the Trump term brought to the American foreign policy consensus. how much of that disruption has been reversed, or if I may use the word repaired? And my follow-up question to that would be, what is the lesson for foreign policy disruptors and its shelf life, as it were? Knowing that we're getting so many disruptor politicians around the world these days in this era, what is the shelf life for such disruptions?
All right, great. Well, you're an opinion editor, is that right? I'm an opinion writer. I love opinion. So much more fun than journalism. But I used to say on my, I don't know, I think we took it off, but on my Twitter handle, it used to say on my Twitter profile, opinions are like love. The more you give away, the more you have. So, look, I think Trump was a disruptor. Kissinger wrote about Trump that every now and then, when a status quo can no longer be maintained, a historical figure emerges who demonstrates that fact. And if you think about it, the American foreign policy establishments from the end of the Cold War forward really did get some basic things wrong. The consensus, for example, was that history was over. There would not be any more great international contests like the Cold War or the Second World War. There was something of a consensus that the unipolar reality that existed after the Cold War would become a new permanent international norm. And those two ideas, the end of any further contests in the world and American unipolarity, were connected. Then there was the belief that free trade would give free trade to China, and that will democratize China and make Americans rich. And so Americans would increasingly look and say, wait a minute, China is not getting more. In fact, the free trade with China has made China a hostile communist superpower, and it's destroyed millions of American jobs. At least that's the way a lot of people see it. So and then you have the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, no apparent strategy in all of this. Putin becoming steadily more hostile, the Americans not seeming to do a very good job with it. Obama's belief that the Arab Spring represented a permanent democratic transition, so we'll help get rid of Mubarak and then there'll be democracy in Egypt. Oops, it's Muslim Brotherhood, and they don't seem either that democratic or that competent. Now what do we do? So a sense of the establishment having a view of the world that wasn't working. So Trump ran for president essentially, I'm sure you all know the story, the emperor's new clothes. And Trump was the little boy in the crowd who said, he's not wearing anything at all. All right. The fact was, he wasn't. It doesn't mean that Trump knew how to design a new set of clothes for the emperor. Right. But people felt and feel, even people who would never vote for Trump in a million years, that the consensus respectable American foreign policy post-Cold War had not yielded the results that its supporters said that it would. So in that sense, I would say that Trump, it was our bad luck that Trump was was not a constructive statesman, but a critical negative statesman. And that's it. He was a wrecking ball who was destroying the old, and that needed to happen to some degree. But again, ideally, you would want someone who was capable of building something solid and new, and that's not Trump. So So I would say I don't put this in necessarily in some huge global perspective. This was a very American thing. Now you see another, the trend is sort of identity politics strongmen that you see, say, an Erdogan, a Putin, one can think of others. But, that represents something a little bit different. There's some connections with the Trump phenomenon. But I would say in all cases, there's a sense that the old reality is no longer sustainable. So say the Ataturk secularism of Turkey, I myself would not say that Erdogan's Islamism is a terrific new direction for Turkey, but I can certainly see the point that that whole Ataturk kind of artificial secularism of the old Turkey had reached the point where it needed to be put away. It had ossified, it had done all the good it could do, and the longer it lasted, the less good it would be. I'm certainly looking at Russia and Putin. You can say clearly Boris Yeltsin was not a success in Russia, and so it needed another direction. I think Abe in Japan had some of these same characteristics. So again, ideally what you want is someone who both can destroy an old system and replace it with something positive and new. That doesn't happen very often. In our country, it's maybe happened once or twice. Washington, Lincoln, maybe Franklin Roosevelt. But it doesn't happen a lot, and it's your good luck when it comes.
And how do you see Modi in this paradigm?
Sorry?
How do you see Modi in this paradigm?
I'm still trying to figure that out. All right, because I've spent in my life probably at this point a total of 2 months in India, and while by American standards that makes me a real veteran, what it does is it mostly teaches me is how little I understand. I'm getting to the point where I'm almost able to recognize the depth of my ignorance about India. And if I keep diligently studying for a few more years, I hope to achieve that point. So it's hard for me to say. I do think that it seems to me that the old secular identity of India, that sort of Nehruvian idea of India, had never had a deep hold on a lot of people, more the elites than out there. And over time, it seemed to be losing some of its resilience. And also in India, as in other countries, as the sort of masses, the rural masses and so on, become more educated and enter into political life more, and then, they tend to want a more identity-based, a stronger dose of identity in their politics. In the U.S., roughly 50 years after independence, the first 50 years of the U.S., we were basically led by a gentry elite. Washington was a very wealthy planter. His successors were from the higher levels of society. Our politics was very genteel. There was the respect for the civil service was quite high. And then you have the Jacksonian revolution of the 1820s and 30s, where a kind of a mass politics, a lot of the phenomenon that we think of as characteristically American, the universal adult, at that time male and white suffrage, but still no longer an economic requirement to vote, a radical decentralization of institutions, a reduction of the power of the bureaucracy and the civil service. All of these things come along. So in some ways, you can see some of that happening in some post-colonial countries, is that the genteel warriors of independence after a couple of generations are succeeded by people who are less clubbable, as you might say, but have a better nose for mass politics. So I don't know enough about India to really feel truly confident. How do I place a particular individual or a particular party in that dynamic? But it does seem to me that what's happening in India doesn't seem all of that strange or unique as you look at things that are happening around the world. And I would also say, by the way, that it seems to me that there are positive and negative elements in these changes, just as there are in any great political movement. Again, politics, like foreign policy, even the greatest athletes, the greatest teams commit fouls, lose matches, go off on very poor maneuvers. I just don't know enough about India to really have a view, and I'm not sure it would matter to anybody if I did.
One more question. Nainima covers foreign affairs for us.
Thank you for doing this, Professor Mead, and giving us such detailed answers. It's
Just
really
don't call him
enlightening.
Dr. Mead.
I won't,
Right,
and I
he's
didn't do that.
not a doctor, although I play one on TV.
Well, so just wanted to understand, and it's also because I was in Afghanistan last year when the Taliban takeover happened, and I saw the way the situation got completely messed up after what America did there for 20 years. Although it was not a new war in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is quite, they've been seeing it since the 19th century. But when you talk about American role, that it plays around the world, now you touched upon this issue, but what is the Biden administration or any other administration in the future that's going to look at the AFPAC policy? Because that policy is what impacts India directly. And also the fact that now America wants us to look at Russia, you want us to look at Taiwan, but when you left Afghanistan in that mess, and before that Iraq, what is it, the strategy that you actually have right now, probably to make my question simpler, to Afghanistan and Pakistan? Because you can't just wash your hands away. I'm not meaning you, but American government, American foreign policy. So when you talk about foreign policy being the sports, was this great player like America really lost the game? I just want your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, one thing I'd say that, I was very critical of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. That time it wasn't Dr. Kissinger who wrote me an angry note, it was George Soros when I criticized that. So I'd say, first of all, probably in the Biden administration's perception, President Biden had advocated an American withdrawal from Afghanistan really going back to the very early days of the Obama administration. He had initially supported the Iraq War, then came to feel that that was a real error, and had been looking for ways for the U.S. to disengage really since about 2005, 2006. So one could not be surprised that when he's elected president, he implements the policy that he's consistently advocated. And those who were surprised probably have only themselves to blame because he was really consistent during the campaign as well. I think he was, my own sense is that the situation in Afghanistan, while not at all ideal, had reached a state where a very, very small American force that was not directly engaged in combat was successfully providing the kind of cover that allowed the Taliban to be kept up in the hills and for a lot of Afghans to go about their lives in a different way. Unfortunately, it is also true that the Afghan government became steadily more corrupt to some degree because it felt it could always depend on the U.S. It was not that good at developing the institutions and the practices that could have enabled the people of Afghanistan who didn't want to live under Taliban rule to develop a healthy state of their own. And it's also true that you just can't expect foreigners to protect you forever. I wish we had stayed, but in American public opinion, someone says, well, why is my kid being sent thousands of miles away so that some other mother's kid can have a better life? What about my kid's life? Also, what's your theory of victory? When will we be able to stop that politicians after 20 years could not really give answers, convincing answers to those questions? I think it's just not surprising that after 20 years, you would see a change in policy. In terms of losing the game, what I would probably say is the people who really wanted the withdrawal from Afghanistan were people who felt that the game was not important to the United States. That Pakistan is a long way away. It's a completely unsatisfactory ally, but as an enemy, it can't do that much to the United States. And Afghanistan, well, if a new Osama bin Laden goes back there and tries to organize something, we have satellites, we have drones, and maybe we can take care of our needs in Afghanistan without a permanent presence on the ground. I don't have answers. It's one of those things. This is one of those places where in foreign policy, the choice is often not between good and bad, but between bad and worse, or even between worse and catastrophic. And many choices in foreign policy are like that. And I think this is one of them. I would agree that a weakness there was the failure to bring India into American decision-making earlier on. Now, I think, I'm not sure India would have liked the results of that, because the Americans would be saying, well, hey, you want something going on in Afghanistan? Where are the Indian troops? You say this is a vital interest to you. It's not a vital interest to us. So if it's a vital interest to you, why don't you do something about it? I don't think the Americans received a lot of concrete proposals from the Indians about how India was going to take some of the burden of the United States off the United States for Afghanistan, a country that is of much more importance to India than to the U.S. So I would say probably that both in Delhi and in Washington, there was a kind of insufficiency of imagination. Again, this is one reason I would like to see the deepening of the infrastructure of the relationship, so that Americans and Indians are talking more about the issues that really matter to them. And the Indians, knowing that the Americans are approaching an end to their place in Afghanistan, would start engaging about, well, what does that mean, and how do we affect that decision, and what do we need to do? And the Americans might well say, well, if India will take up half the garrison, maybe we'll stay. But I think these conversations they weren't had to the degree they needed to be.
I think we'll let him go, but before we let you go, I'll ask you the last question. And I'll also make you a request. The request is that tell them a little bit about that 1930s song that you used in your speech, on where India featured in the American debate.
Let's see. I don't know if I can pull up the song.
When the debate was over whether US should support Britain as a democracy or not.
Oh, that's right. Well, that was the isolationists in the 1930s were arguing the United States should not have an alliance with Britain. And one of the arguments that they brought forward was that Britain wasn't a democracy. You might say, well, why would that be? Because, the British have elections and so on. And the answer in this song, the answer was that the British Empire is not a democracy.
So Indians can't vote.
Right, exactly. And I'm not sure. I wish, again, this is a place where Americans don't know enough about Indian history, and many Indians don't know enough about American history. But American opposition to the British Empire in India was a major factor in American politics and public life in the 20s and 30s. It had a lot to do with the American disinclination to support the British. It even comes up after World War II, when the British come to the Americans asking for very large loans. And the Americans basically say, listen, after World War I, we loaned you a lot of money then, and you used it to bolster up your empire. You had plenty of money to shoot people in northern India, but you apparently didn't have any money to pay your debts to the United States. And you fooled us once, but you won't fool us twice. Churchill, some of the most bitter arguments that Churchill and Roosevelt had over the war were Roosevelt really wanted Britain, for the sake of the war effort, to promise independence to India. And Churchill, of course, that was not his vision of where the world should go. But I think this history and the intellectual history of American anti-imperialism in the 20s and 30s, partly because of the missionary movement and the sort of person-to-person connections, partly because of just an ideological opposition to European colonialism. The Americans at that time had already decided, we're going to give the Philippines independence at the earliest possible moment, and the transition was underway. So that would be, again, I think deeper study of the history of the two societies would benefit everybody in both.
And I just learned today, you always learn new things, that during the American Civil War,
Revolution,
Hyder Ali, Tipu Sultan's father, was hailed as a great hero.
Right. After the Battle of Yorktown, this I learned from Mike Watson, who works with me at Hudson. And like a lot of young people, he works harder than the old people. You may have noticed this. And finds out new information because he stays up late researching while the old people are watching TV. Found out that at the Battle of Yorktown, which is the decisive battle in the Revolution when Cornwallis surrendered before he came over here, the American soldiers gave 12 toasts with their French allies to celebrate their victory. And something like the 10th toast was to the great anti-British hero of India.
Hyder Ali.
Yeah, Hyder Ali. So George Washington knew who Hyder Ali was and saw him as engaged in a common thing. But, the U.S.-India connection goes back older. Eli Yale, who gave the money for Yale College, actually as a British colonial from Connecticut in the 17th century, got a job with the East India Company in Chennai. And got married in Chennai, and his wedding registry is in the church in Chennai to this day. The Brown University was founded with profits that were made by American traders trading with India in, I think, as early as the 18th century. So even at the level of the sort of early Ivy League universities, the India-U.S. connection is much deeper. The fact that the U.S. had a flourishing trade with India during the War of 1812, when the British actually wanted American ships involved in the trade for two reasons. One reason was that the American flag was less likely to be attacked by the French, and so it was a safer way to do it. But the other was that a lot of East Indian officials knew they could put their private wealth on an American ship, and you wouldn't have any of these company auditors looking and checking to see what they were doing. But we had a very flourishing trade. And then when the war ended and the British reasserted their control, they really discriminated against American trade and American investments and so on. And that helped generate in the US the consensus that Asia mattered and that we needed to prevent any single country from dominating Asia in order to protect America's economic future. So in that sense, the Indian experience, and even when India was not independent, the relationship with India has played a much more formative role in the development of American attitudes about the world than people generally understand, either here or there.
And my final question, is Biden actually such a bore, or does he suffer from a comparison with Trump? Because Trump was so entertaining.
President Biden has had a long and distinguished career in American life. I don't think that being interesting has ever been one of the characteristics that he's been most associated with. That he is, however, one of our more loquacious presidents. They say partly he's had a very bad stutter as a child. And this, in overcoming the stutter, he was encouraged to talk a lot. And he has continued to do that to this day.
I think we'll let you go. He has other meetings, so thank you very much. And once again, Walter, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to see you
in our newsroom.
All right. Great to see you. Next year in Switzerland.
Next year.